The Hollow House. The carriage rattled along the uneven road, its wheels churning up dust in the dying light of the evening. Jonathan Halloway pulled his coat tighter around him, glancing warily at the silhouette looming ahead, the mansion of Blackthorne Hollow. It had stood for centuries, a monument to its cursed lineage, and now it belonged to him. An unexpected inheritance from a distant uncle, the house had been left untouched for decades, abandoned after a string of misfortunes that plagued the Halloway family. The moment he stepped through the towering oak doors, an oppressive weight settled on him. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and decay. The walls, lined with faded tapestries, seemed to whisper with the sighs of forgotten voices. A grand chandelier hung above, its crystals dulled by years of neglect. "Master Halloway, welcome to Blackthorne Hollow." The butler, Mr. Finch, appeared from the shadows, his face etched with deep lines, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Thank you," Jonathan replied, trying to shake off the chill creeping down his spine. "I trust everything has been prepared." "As well as it can be, sir. This house has its peculiarities. But you shall find your chambers in order." Jonathan followed him up the grand staircase, each step groaning underfoot. The corridors stretched endlessly, lit only by flickering sconces. He could feel it already, the presence. Not of a living soul, but something else. Something watching. That night, sleep evaded him. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes. Then, just past the hour of midnight, he heard it, a soft knock at his bedroom door. He sat up, heart pounding. Who is it? Silence. Cautiously, he rose and opened the door. The corridor was empty. But as he stepped back inside, he noticed something. His mirror, a tall and aged piece with an ornate silver frame, had fogged over, as if someone had breathed against it. And in the condensation, a single word had been traced by an unseen hand. "Leave." Jonathan's pulse quickened. He reached out, wiping the message away, telling himself it was his imagination. But the unease settled deep within him, refusing to be ignored. The next day, he explored the house. The library was cavernous, filled with dusty tomes and secrets long forgotten. The paintings lining the halls depicted his ancestors, solemn, watchful figures, their eyes seeming to follow him. One portrait in particular unsettled him, a woman dressed in black, her face shrouded in shadow. The nameplate beneath read Eleanor Halloway, 1764. "A tragic figure," came Finch's voice from behind him. Jonathan started. "Apologies, sir. I did not mean to startle you." "Who was she?" Jonathan asked. "Lady Eleanor. They say she was wronged, and that she never left." Jonathan frowned. "Never left?" Finch hesitated. "This house holds many stories. Some say she still walks these halls. Watching. Waiting." That night, the knocking returned. More insistent. And when Jonathan opened his eyes, the mirror had fogged over again, the message more urgent this time. "He sees you." Panic coiled around his chest. He turned sharply, and froze. The portrait of Eleanor, which had hung in the hall, was now propped against the wall inside his room. He hadn't brought it there. No one had. A breath of cold air caressed the back of his neck. He spun, but there was nothing, only the oppressive darkness pressing in. Then the whisper came, a voice like crumbling leaves and distant sorrow. "You should not have come." Jonathan's breath hitched. The mirror, the portrait, the warnings, they were not the workings of an overactive imagination. Something was here. Something restless. And it had finally taken notice of him. The following evening, unable to ignore the growing unease, Jonathan ventured into the mansion's forbidden wing, a section sealed off for generations. Dust blanketed every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of neglect. As he stepped inside, the temperature plummeted. The flickering candle in his hand barely held back the swallowing darkness. A soft creak echoed through the corridor. He wasn't alone. Jonathan turned sharply, holding his breath. In the dim glow of the candlelight, a shadow moved. A figure stood at the far end of the hallway, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness itself. The candle's flame trembled. "Who's there?" he demanded. The figure did not move. Did not breathe. But Jonathan felt its eyes, cold and unwavering, locked onto him. Then, in a voice that sent ice through his veins, it spoke. "You cannot hide from him." The candle flickered violently, and with a sudden gust of unseen wind, the flame was snuffed out. Darkness swallowed him whole. A cold, skeletal hand brushed against his arm. He recoiled, stumbling backward. He could hear something breathing now, slow, deliberate, and far too close. Then, a whisper, softer than before but filled with unmistakable menace. "Run." Jonathan didn't hesitate. He turned and bolted through the corridor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The darkness pressed in, shifting, moving. The house itself seemed to twist, corridors stretching unnaturally, doors vanishing where they should have been. He reached the staircase, but it wasn't there. The floor gaped before him like an abyss, swallowing the lower level in impossible blackness. He spun around. The figure stood just feet away now, its face obscured in shadow. But the eyes, cold, luminous slits, pierced the darkness. Jonathan backed away. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice barely more than a whisper. The figure did not answer. It raised a hand, skeletal fingers outstretched. The walls trembled, the very air in the room seeming to shudder in its wake. Then, all at once, the house let out a groaning wail, like something ancient waking from slumber. Jonathan screamed as the floor beneath him gave way, plunging him into the unknown depths below. He awoke in darkness, his body sprawled across cold stone. A new chamber, vast and ancient, stretched before him. Flickering torches lined the walls, casting long shadows. At the center stood a massive stone altar, carved with the same sigil he had seen in the library. Something stirred beyond the torches, a rustling, a whisper of movement. Then, from the darkness, a voice, no longer a whisper, but a deep and commanding presence. "Jonathan Halloway, you are the last." The shadows twisted, forming into something colossal and inhuman. Its eyes, burning like molten gold, locked onto him. Jonathan tried to move, but the air itself seemed to hold him in place. The weight of centuries, of old blood and broken oaths, bore down upon him. And then, as the creature stepped forward, the truth struck him with dreadful clarity. He had never inherited Blackthorne Hollow. It had inherited him. The house at Black Hollow. The road to Black Hollow twisted like a serpent, cutting through the dense, ancient forest that seemed to murmur secrets with every gust of wind. Nathaniel Gray tightened his grip on the reins of his horse-drawn carriage as the skeletal branches overhead intertwined, casting claw-like shadows upon the damp earth. The letter in his coat pocket felt heavier than mere parchment, its words seared into his mind, "Underscore your uncle is dead. You are the last of the Gray family. Return to Black Hollow, underscore." Nathaniel had scarcely thought of his uncle in years. Theodore Gray had been a recluse, a man spoken of in hushed tones even among the townsfolk of Raven's Hire, who themselves were not known for their warmth. The Gray estate, an enormous Gothic mansion perched atop the cliffs overlooking the restless sea, had loomed over Nathaniel's childhood like a specter. Now, it was his. The iron gates groaned as he pushed them open, the massive house beyond seeming to breathe with the shifting mist. Gargoyles perched along the roof, their stone faces eroded by time, their gaping mouths seeming to whisper warnings. As he stepped inside, the scent of dust, damp wood, and something else, something metallic, filled his nostrils. The butler, an impossibly thin man with skin the color of wax, introduced himself as Mr. Halloway. "The house has been awaiting your return, sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel shivered. "Awaiting?" You mean the staff? There is no staff, sir. Only myself. And the house itself. The dining room had been prepared for him, a single candle illuminating the long, empty table. Silverware gleamed under the dim light, and a plate of food sat untouched at the far end. Mr. Halloway gestured for Nathaniel to sit. Who set the table? Nathaniel asked. The butler's expression remained unchanged. The house, sir. That night, Nathaniel was restless. The sheets of his massive four-poster bed felt cold and damp, as if they had not been touched in years. Sleep came fitfully, broken by the groaning of the house, the faint rustling of unseen movement. Then, the whispers began. You are home, Nathaniel sat upright, heart hammering. The voice had been close, too close. He fumbled for the candle, striking a match to light it. The flame flickered, casting long, trembling shadows against the ornate wallpaper. The air felt thick, heavy with something unseen yet undeniably present. Then he saw it. At the foot of his bed stood a figure, tall and thin, with hollowed-out eyes that gleamed like embers in the darkness. Its presence was wrong, something that should not exist within the realm of the living. Nathaniel opened his mouth to scream, but the figure lifted one skeletal finger to its lips. Silence. And then it was gone. The following days only deepened the mystery. Rooms changed when he was not looking, doors leading to different hallways, windows vanishing overnight. The great portrait of his uncle in the main hall seemed to shift when he was not watching, the painted eyes following him with unnatural intensity. Nathaniel began to hear the stories from the villagers. They spoke of his uncle's descent into madness, of secret rituals performed in the depths of the house, of the forbidden room at the top of the west tower that no servant had ever dared enter. It was on the seventh night that Nathaniel found the key. It had been left on his bedside table, though he had never placed it there. He knew, with the certainty of a condemned man, that it belonged to the door in the west tower. The climb to the tower was long, the candle in his hand barely piercing the suffocating darkness. At last, he reached the door. The key slid into the lock with unnatural ease. The door groaned open, revealing a room lined with mirrors, tall, thin, warped as if the glass had been twisted by unseen hands. And in every reflection, he saw himself. But not as he was. In the mirrors, his face was pale, his eyes sunken, his lips bloodless. He watched as his reflection turned to him, moving independently, a slow, knowing smile stretching across its face. You were always meant to return, it whispered. Nathaniel stumbled backward, his breath hitching. The mirrors began to tremble, a low humming filling the air. He turned to run, but the door slammed shut, the candle extinguished in a sudden gust of air. Then, the whispers rose. And the house at Black Hollow claimed its last heir.